Great Zimbabwe, the magnificent city of stone and gold, rises from the heart of southern Africa, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of an ancient civilization. Long lost to history, its ruins stand as silent witnesses to a past that still echoes through the region. Yet, in a time when the world was obsessed with empires and conquests, Great Zimbabwe was a thriving urban center that flourished in ways many believed impossible for the African continent. This is the story of a city that once pulsed with life, wealth, and power, now nearly forgotten, yet crucial in understanding the complex histories of Africa's past. At its peak, Great Zimbabwe was the center of a vast trading empire, its reach extending far beyond the borders of modern-day Zimbabwe. It was a city built on the foundations of trade, where gold, ivory, and other resources flowed through the streets, carried by merchants from across the Indian Ocean. The city's stone walls, intricate stonework, and massive enclosures, known as the Great Enclosure and the Hill Complex, serve as a visual reminder of a time when this settlement was a nexus of culture, power, and influence. The first settlers to the area arrived as early as the 11th century, although the rise of Great Zimbabwe as a formidable city-state began in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. It was a society defined not by war and conquest, but by trade, resource management, and strategic alliances with far-reaching connections. The city was an African marvel, one of the few of its kind, and it prospered as a center of political, economic, and social life for several centuries. As time passed, however, its influence and wealth began to attract the attention of outside forces, both external and internal, though it ultimately contribute to its decline. The city's most enduring feature is its architecture. The stone structures of Great Zimbabwe, particularly the dry stone walls, are an architectural feat that challenges any preconceived notions of ancient African civilizations. The walls were built without the use of mortar, a technique that still puzzles historians today. These structures were not only residential, but also symbolized power, wealth, and cultural achievement. The Great Enclosure, the largest and most impressive structure in the city, stands as an iconic symbol of this once thriving kingdom. It was not just a building. It was a statement of dominance, a reflection of the wealth that flowed into Great Zimbabwe from its vast trading network. Within this network, Great Zimbabwe's leaders controlled a complex trade system. The city became a focal point for the trade of gold, which was highly coveted by the Arabs, Chinese, and Europeans who were eager to obtain the precious metal. It was not just gold, however. Ivory, iron, and animal skins were among the other goods that passed through the city. These commodities were exchanged for luxury goods like ceramics, glass beads, and other precious items from as far away as China and the Middle East. The wealth that this trade generated gave the rulers of Great Zimbabwe immense power, but also made the kingdom vulnerable. In time, other African kingdoms and foreign traders would seek to undermine Great Zimbabwe's supremacy. Great Zimbabwe's role in the Indian Ocean trade network was central to its rise and power. The kingdom's proximity to the Indian Ocean allowed it to access markets in India, Arabia, and beyond. The city's involvement in the export of gold, ivory, and other goods made it an integral part of a global economy that connected Africa to distant corners of the world. The trade networks that flowed through Great Zimbabwe were vast and intricate, linking the city to distant regions of Africa and even the Middle East. But as with any major trading hub, there were also risks, and these risks would come to define much of the city's fate. Great Zimbabwe's rulers, known as the Matapa, maintained their dominance through strategic alliances and trade monopolies. The kingdom had a highly organized political structure, with a strong central authority that ruled over a network of smaller states and chiefdoms. The Matapa controlled access to the valuable resources that flowed through Great Zimbabwe, and their wealth gave them the power to exert influence over other kingdoms and traders. This economic power was a major factor in the city's growth and success, but it also made the kingdom a target for foreign invaders and rival African kingdoms. Despite its wealth and power, Great Zimbabwe faced significant internal challenges. The arrival of European traders and settlers in the late 15th century began to disrupt the delicate balance that had allowed the kingdom to thrive. Portuguese traders who sought to control the gold trade became increasingly involved in the region. Their presence marked the beginning of external interference in the affairs of Great Zimbabwe. The Portuguese sought to monopolize the gold trade, cutting out local merchants and eventually establishing their own trading networks in the region. This undermined Great Zimbabwe's position as the primary trade hub, and over time, the city's power began to wane. Internally, the kingdom faced mounting pressures as well. Environmental changes, including a series of droughts, affected agriculture and food production, which were vital to sustaining the city's population. The scarcity of resources, combined with the political fragmentation that began to take hold within Great Zimbabwe's leadership, led to tensions among the city's ruling class. As power struggles intensified, the kingdom began to weaken, and its once mighty influence slowly eroded. The decline of Great Zimbabwe was not a singular event, but a gradual process that unfolded over several decades. By the late 15th century, the city's economic power had dwindled, and the once bustling trade routes that had sustained it were no longer as profitable. The rise of new political powers, both within Africa and beyond, shifted the balance of power in the region. The Matapo were unable to maintain control over the vast trade networks that had made Great Zimbabwe great, and the city's once thriving population began to disperse. By the early 17th century, Great Zimbabwe had largely been abandoned, its ruins standing as a silent monument to a civilization that had risen and fallen in the midst of the complex and shifting forces of history. The city was forgotten by many, and its story would remain shrouded in mystery for centuries to come. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe, however, did not vanish with the fall of the city. The cultural and architectural influences of the kingdom left an indelible mark on the region, shaping the development of later civilizations and kingdoms. The intricate stonework and dry stone construction techniques used in Great Zimbabwe's buildings would be replicated by subsequent generations, and the city's role as a trade hub influenced the evolution of regional commerce for centuries. The history of Great Zimbabwe, though often overshadowed by the colonial narratives that dominated African history, remains an essential part of the continent's past. It is a reminder that Africa's history is not defined by a singular narrative, but by a complex tapestry of civilizations, cultures, and societies that have shaped the world in ways both seen and unseen. In rediscovering Great Zimbabwe, we do more than uncover the ruins of a lost city. We gain a deeper understanding of Africa's historical and cultural contributions to the world. As we look at the remains of this once great civilization, we are reminded that Africa's past is rich and multifaceted, filled with stories of resilience, creativity, and achievement. Great Zimbabwe is not merely a relic of the past, but a symbol of Africa's enduring legacy. In the heart of the African continent, surrounded by the wilderness of the great savannas and the towering mountains of the Zimbabwe Plateau, the city of Great Zimbabwe began to rise to prominence during the late 12th century. At the time, the region was already home to ancient societies, but it was the emergence of Great Zimbabwe's political and economic power that would distinguish it as one of the most significant centers of African civilization in the medieval period. By the time the first stone was laid to build the iconic walls that would later define the city's grandeur, the foundations of a kingdom had already been established, its influence set to shape the region for centuries. Great Zimbabwe's creation was not the product of one ruler's vision or ambition, nor was it the outcome of a singular event. It was, rather, the gradual crystallization of a cultural and political phenomenon, born out of centuries of trade, migration, and the interplay of various African kingdoms. The formation of the city was inseparable from the history of the region, a history that unfolded slowly, with local chiefdoms and smaller societies growing into a larger, more organized political entity. The earliest settlers of the Great Zimbabwe region were part of a complex web of trade routes that connected the African interior to coastal ports along the Indian Ocean. These early communities were deeply embedded in the regional economy, where iron smelting, agriculture, and cattle herding formed the backbone of their existence. Over time, these communities began to interact with one another, exchanging goods, ideas, and culture, and thus sowing the seeds for the urban civilization that would eventually emerge in Great Zimbabwe. The rise of Great Zimbabwe as a political and economic center can be traced to the strategic location of the region itself. Positioned along well-established trade routes, the city was ideally placed to become a central hub for the circulation of goods. From the mountains of the interior came gold, which was highly prized by distant trading partners across the Indian Ocean. Ivory, cattle, and iron were also valuable commodities, and they too passed through the city on their way to foreign markets. The wealth generated by the flow of these goods enabled the rulers of Great Zimbabwe to establish a powerful political system based on control of the region's resources and trade. As trade networks expanded, the kingdom's reach extended far beyond the borders of modern Zimbabwe. By the mid-13th century, Great Zimbabwe had established links with traders from the Swahili Coast and even beyond to the Arabian Peninsula, India, and China. This transcontinental network allowed the city to acquire luxury goods such as glass beads, ceramics, and textiles, as well as precious metals and stones. The exchange was not just about material wealth. It was also a conduit for the flow of ideas and cultural practices. The influence of Islam, brought by Arab traders, began to permeate the region, along with architectural styles, literacy, and concepts of governance that were shared through trade contacts. At the heart of Great Zimbabwe's growing power was its leadership. The Mwene Matapa, the king of the region, stood as the central figure of political and religious authority. This ruler was not just a political leader, but a divine figure, believed to have been chosen by the gods to oversee the kingdom's prosperity. The Mwene Matapa's authority was reinforced by control over the trade of gold, which was a key source of the kingdom's wealth. The gold was mined in the rivers and mountains surrounding the city and was traded at markets along the coast. By controlling the gold trade, the Mwene Matapa not only accumulated immense wealth, but also held sway over the surrounding regions, cementing their power as a leader of regional influence. The administration of Great Zimbabwe was organized and hierarchical, with smaller chiefs overseeing different areas of the kingdom, and a complex system of tribute and taxation in place to sustain the kingdom's growth. The centralized control of wealth allowed the rulers to exert influence over neighboring regions, enforcing trade monopolies and ensuring that the flow of goods remained under their command. At the same time, the kingdom's political system was flexible, allowing for alliances with other kingdoms and societies in order to preserve the flow of resources. The network of alliances that Great Zimbabwe built with neighboring regions and traders ensured the kingdom's survival and prosperity for centuries. The construction of the city's grand stone structures was not only a reflection of the kingdom's wealth, but also a demonstration of the sophistication of its culture. The use of dry stone masonry to build the walls of the great enclosure and other monumental buildings was an extraordinary achievement, particularly given the lack of mortar and the difficulty of working with massive stones. The great enclosure, in particular, stood as a symbol of the kingdom's power, a vast and imposing structure that still stands today as a marvel of ancient engineering. The city's architecture, built with such precision and artistry, reflected not only the economic power of Great Zimbabwe, but also its cultural identity. The choice to build with stone was a deliberate one, stone being a material that symbolized permanence, strength, and the divine. The internal structure of Great Zimbabwe itself was also highly organized. The city was designed with both practicality and symbolism in mind, with different areas dedicated to residential, ceremonial, and commercial activities. At the heart of the city, the hill complex served as the seat of power, housing the Mwene Matapa and the royal court. Surrounding the hill complex were the dwellings of the nobility, merchants, and craftsmen, with other sections of the city dedicated to trade, agriculture, and religious ceremonies. The arrangement of the city's buildings, with its enclosed spaces and winding pathways, created a sense of security and order, while also reinforcing the idea that the city was a sacred space, protected by both divine and earthly forces. As the wealth of Great Zimbabwe grew, so too did its cultural influence. The kingdom's merchants became renowned for their skills in producing and trading goods that were highly sought after, and Great Zimbabwe became an important cultural center in the region. The city was home to skilled artisans who created finely crafted pottery, jewelry, and textiles, which were traded across the continent and beyond. These items were not just valuable for their craftsmanship, but also served as symbols of the cultural identity of the people of Great Zimbabwe. The rich cultural life of the city, expressed through its art and trade, contributed to the lasting legacy of the kingdom, influencing neighboring societies and cultures for generations to come. However, the growth of Great Zimbabwe was not without its challenges. As the kingdom expanded, it began to encounter external pressures from other kingdoms and rival states that sought to control the lucrative trade routes and resources of the region. The Portuguese, arriving on the eastern coast of Africa in the late 15th century, were among the first Europeans to establish trade relations with the kingdom. While the Portuguese initially engaged in peaceful trade, their increasing involvement in the gold trade soon led to conflict with Great Zimbabwe's rulers. The Portuguese, intent on controlling the gold trade, sought to undermine the authority of the Matapa, creating tensions that would have long-term consequences for the kingdom. Internally, the pressures of expansion also took their toll. As the city's population grew, so too did demands for resources, and the need to sustain a large, complex society created significant challenges. The depletion of nearby resources, coupled with changes in the region's climate that affected agriculture, began to strain the kingdom's economy. The system that had sustained Great Zimbabwe for so long was becoming increasingly fragile. Despite these challenges, Great Zimbabwe's legacy as one of Africa's most influential cities endures. The kingdom's rise to power, its control over vital trade routes, and its lasting cultural and architectural achievements continue to shape our understanding of Africa's history. Even in the face of external pressures and internal strain, Great Zimbabwe's rulers were able to create a society that, for several centuries, stood as a beacon of African civilization. The city of stone and gold, though eventually abandoned, remains a symbol of Africa's rich and complex history. Its story is not just one of wealth and power, but of resilience, creativity, and the enduring legacy of a civilization that once defined the landscape of southern Africa. The decline of Great Zimbabwe, though gradual and multifaceted, marks one of the most intriguing chapters in African history. By the time the 15th century dawned, the once thriving city, with its majestic stone walls and bustling trade routes, had begun to show signs of vulnerability. What had been a center of unparalleled power and wealth was now on the precipice of change, its fate intertwined with both internal strife and external pressures. The forces that led to the eventual fall of Great Zimbabwe were not sudden nor easily understood, for they were shaped by a combination of environmental factors, shifting political landscapes, and the introduction of foreign influences that gradually eroded the kingdom's foundations. For much of its early history, Great Zimbabwe had relied on the complex network of trade routes that connected it to distant lands. It was through these routes that the kingdom's leaders accumulated vast wealth, controlling the trade of gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities. But by the 15th century, the flow of these resources had begun to falter. Several factors contributed to this decline, with one of the most significant being the depletion of the region's natural resources. The gold mines that had once sustained the kingdom's prosperity were gradually exhausted, and the agricultural land that had supported the growing population of the city was becoming less fertile. The impact of these environmental changes cannot be understated, as they were key to the kingdom's ability to maintain its power and influence. The once thriving trade in gold, which had made Great Zimbabwe a central player in regional and international commerce, began to dwindle, and the kingdom found itself increasingly unable to sustain its economic model. The depletion of resources was compounded by political fragmentation within the kingdom itself. As the wealth of Great Zimbabwe grew, so did the complexity of its political system. The Matapa, once a powerful central authority, began to lose control over the many smaller chiefdoms and states that had once been part of the kingdom's larger political structure. This decentralization of power created divisions within the kingdom, as regional leaders sought greater autonomy and control over the resources that had once been centralized in the capital. This shift in political dynamics weakened the authority of the Matapa and made it more difficult to maintain the unity that had been essential to the kingdom's success. As a result, the kingdom began to fragment into smaller, competing factions, each vying for control over the remaining resources. The internal challenges faced by Great Zimbabwe were further exacerbated by external pressures, particularly from the Portuguese. The arrival of Portuguese traders and settlers along the eastern coast of Africa in the late 15th century marked the beginning of a new era for the kingdom. The Portuguese, eager to gain control over the lucrative gold trade, sought to establish direct access to the sources of gold in the interior. They soon realized that Great Zimbabwe was a key player in the trade network and sought to establish relationships with the kingdom's rulers. However, these early interactions were not without tension. While the Portuguese were initially welcomed as trading partners, their increasing involvement in the gold trade and their efforts to monopolize the flow of resources soon caused friction with the local population and the Matapa. The Portuguese were not content to simply engage in trade. They sought to control the gold trade entirely, bypassing Great Zimbabwe's established trade routes and establishing their own networks. They began to build fortresses along the eastern coast, which allowed them to establish a foothold in the region. Their influence slowly extended inland, and they began to interfere in the affairs of the kingdom. The Portuguese efforts to dominate the gold trade created economic and political instability within Great Zimbabwe. As the Portuguese established their own trade routes and outposts, the flow of gold through Great Zimbabwe was disrupted, and the kingdom's economic base began to crumble. The introduction of Portuguese power also had cultural and religious implications. As the Portuguese missionaries sought to spread Christianity, they brought with them a worldview that was at odds with the indigenous religious practices of Great Zimbabwe. This cultural clash further strained relations between the Portuguese and the local population. While some elites may have embraced the Portuguese presence, many in the kingdom resisted foreign influence and sought to preserve their own traditional ways of life. This resistance contributed to a growing sense of internal strife within the kingdom, as various factions either aligned themselves with or opposed the Portuguese presence. At the same time, the social fabric of Great Zimbabwe was beginning to unravel. The kingdom's once cohesive society, with its strong leadership and centralized authority, was becoming increasingly fragmented. As the resources upon which the city had been built dwindled, the urban centers of Great Zimbabwe began to lose their luster. The once grand structures, including the Great Enclosure, were no longer symbols of a flourishing empire, but reminders of a past that was slipping away. As the city's population shrank, the once thriving commercial and religious hubs of the city became abandoned, and the grandeur of the city began to fade into memory. One of the key factors in the decline of Great Zimbabwe was the growing inability of the kingdom's leadership to adapt to changing circumstances. While the kingdom had once been a thriving center of trade and culture, its leaders were unable to maintain their control over the vital resources that had sustained it. The fragmentation of political authority, the depletion of gold mines, and the encroachment of Portuguese power all contributed to a growing sense of instability. The kingdom, which had once been united under the Matapa, now faced internal divisions and external threats that it could not withstand. By the early 16th century, the decline of Great Zimbabwe was well underway. The city's political and economic power had waned, and its once proud leaders were now faced with the challenge of holding onto what remained of their influence. The arrival of new trading partners and the shifting dynamics of international commerce further diminished the kingdom's role in the regional economy. The Portuguese, having established themselves along the coast, gradually took control of the gold trade, relegating Great Zimbabwe to the status of a secondary player in the region's economy. Despite these pressures, the fall of Great Zimbabwe was not instantaneous. The city continued to function for several more decades, though its influence and power had waned significantly. The kingdom's eventual collapse was a slow process, marked by a gradual decline in population, resource depletion, and political fragmentation. The last remnants of Great Zimbabwe's once mighty empire were lost to time, as the city was abandoned by its people and left to be reclaimed by the encroaching wilderness. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe, however, did not fade entirely. The city's ruins continued to stand as a testament to the achievements of a civilization that had once been at the forefront of African trade and culture. While the kingdom itself fell into obscurity, its influence continued to be felt throughout the region. The architectural marvels of Great Zimbabwe, particularly the dry stone structures that still stand today, serve as a reminder of the ingenuity and skill of the people who built them. The city's story, though overshadowed by the arrival of European powers and the forces of colonialism, remains an important chapter in the history of Africa. The decline of Great Zimbabwe is a complex and multifaceted tale shaped by environmental, political, and external forces. Its fall is a reminder of the fragility of power and the ways in which empires, no matter how grand, can be undone by forces beyond their control. Yet, even in its decline, Great Zimbabwe left an enduring legacy, a legacy that continues to inform our understanding of Africa's rich and diverse history. Its rise and fall serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overextension and the importance of adaptability in the face of change. Great Zimbabwe may have fallen, but its story continues to resonate, offering valuable lessons for future generations. As the 16th century unfolded, the story of Great Zimbabwe began to shift from a vibrant kingdom of stone and gold to a site of mystery and speculation. The once thriving city, which had been at the epicenter of trade, culture, and power in southeastern Africa, had gradually lost its former glory. But even as the kingdom's political and economic influence waned, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe endured. Its ruins, silently standing amidst the dry savanna, would continue to provoke questions, drawing attention from both local inhabitants and distant foreigners. As the world around it changed, the significance of the city began to take on new dimensions, and its story became more than just a tale of decline. It became a symbol of an ancient civilization that had left its mark on history. By the mid-1500s, the abandonment of Great Zimbabwe was largely complete. The remnants of its once great architecture, the towering stone walls, the vast enclosures, and the intricate structures, stood in eerie silence, their former vibrancy now only visible in the decay of the stonework and the crumbling foundations. While the Mwini Matapa and their court had retreated into smaller, more fragmented kingdoms, the city itself had lost its role as a political and economic center. The disruption caused by the depletion of gold mines, the shifting nature of trade, and the encroachment of Portuguese influence along the coast had combined to strip the kingdom of its former wealth and power. What had been a bustling, wealthy city at the heart of a transcontinental trade network now seemed to be a forgotten monument to a lost age. Despite its decline, Great Zimbabwe continued to hold a place of fascination for those who encountered it. For the Portuguese, who had established a foothold along the southeastern coast of Africa, the ruins of the city were both a symbol of the riches that had once flowed through the region and a reminder of a world that they were striving to dominate. The Portuguese began to explore the hinterlands, establishing trade links with the remnants of Great Zimbabwe's former allies and trading partners. While they were focused on establishing their own control over the region's resources, they were also confronted with the question of who had built the magnificent city that still stood as a testament to the wealth and sophistication of the past. The mystery of Great Zimbabwe's origins became a subject of debate and intrigue among European explorers, traders, and missionaries. Many early European accounts of the city were filled with speculation. Some dismissed the idea that African peoples could have built such a magnificent city, attributing the ruins to ancient Phoenicians, Arabs, or even biblical figures. The notion that the African peoples themselves were responsible for the creation of Great Zimbabwe was not widely accepted in the early stages of European exploration. The belief in European racial superiority and the corresponding notion that Africa had no history beyond tribal societies made it difficult for many to accept that such a sophisticated urban center could have been built by Africans. As a result, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe became a puzzle that many sought to solve, but whose true authorship was often disputed or misattributed. While European scholars and adventurers debated the origins of Great Zimbabwe, the local people who had lived near the city, as well as those who had descended from the original inhabitants, continued to hold the ruins in reverence. The Shona people, whose ancestors had built and inhabited Great Zimbabwe, never forgot the importance of the city and its place in their history. For them, the ruins were not just a relic of the past, but a living memory of their cultural heritage. They remembered the days when the city was a hub of activity, when its rulers were powerful, and when its walls stood as symbols of African greatness. Despite the decline of the city, the spiritual and cultural significance of Great Zimbabwe remained a central part of the Shona people's identity. In the centuries following the abandonment of Great Zimbabwe, the ruins became a place of myth and legend. The city was often described as Africa's Stonehenge, a mysterious and sacred site whose true origins were lost to history. Local traditions and oral histories began to intertwine with the growing fascination of European explorers. Some Shona stories spoke of the ancestral spirits that inhabited the ruins, while others referred to the city as the seat of a great civilization that had once ruled over vast territories. Over time, these myths became part of the lore surrounding the city, adding to its mystique and further obscuring its true history. The intellectual struggle over the identity of Great Zimbabwe would reach a new level in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As European colonial powers expanded their control over Africa, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe became a focal point of archaeological interest. In 1890, the British colonial administrator and explorer Cecil Rhodes, one of the most influential figures in the history of southern Africa, visited the site. Rhodes, who had long been interested in exploiting the resources of the region, was captivated by the ruins, but like many of his contemporaries, he struggled to comprehend how an African civilization could have built such an advanced city. Rhodes' solution to the puzzle was in line with the prevailing European attitude of the time. He believed that the ruins were evidence of a civilization that had been built by ancient peoples from the Middle East, not by the indigenous African population. Rhodes, like many others before him, was unwilling to accept that the people of Great Zimbabwe had been responsible for the construction of the city. He used his influence to promote the idea that the ruins were the work of the Phoenicians, ancient Hebrews, or other foreign civilizations. This theory, known as the foreign origin theory, persisted for many years and became deeply embedded in colonial narratives about African history. By promoting this theory, Rhodes and others sought to erase the indigenous African connection to the ruins and to reinforce the idea that African societies were incapable of achieving such feats of architecture and urban planning on their own. It was only in the early 20th century, with the work of archaeologists like Gertrude Cotton-Thompson, that the true origins of Great Zimbabwe began to be uncovered. Cotton-Thompson, an English archaeologist, conducted extensive excavations at the site in the 1920s and concluded that the ruins were indeed the work of the ancestors of the Shona people. Her findings were revolutionary, as they directly challenged the prevailing theories about the foreign origins of the city. Cotton-Thompson's research demonstrated that the people of Great Zimbabwe had built the city using their own unique architectural techniques, and that the city's rise and fall were part of the broader history of the African continent. Her work was groundbreaking in its recognition of the indigenous origins of Great Zimbabwe, and it helped to shift the narrative about Africa's history, showing that African civilizations were capable of creating great works of art, architecture, and political organization long before European colonialism. The recognition of Great Zimbabwe as an indigenous African creation was an important step in rewriting the history of the continent. Yet, even as scholars began to accept the city's African origins, the legacy of colonial misinterpretation and prejudice continued to shape the way the ruins were viewed. The myth of a lost civilization persisted in the popular imagination, and the ruins of Great Zimbabwe remained a symbol of Africa's forgotten greatness, a greatness that had been obscured for centuries by colonial narratives and misconceptions. In the end, the story of Great Zimbabwe is one of both triumph and tragedy. It is a story of a powerful kingdom that once stood at the center of a vast trading network, whose rulers built one of the most remarkable cities in Africa. It is also a story of how that kingdom fell into decline, its power eroded by internal fragmentation, external pressures, and the exhaustion of resources. But perhaps most importantly, it is a story of resilience. The people of Great Zimbabwe may have abandoned their city, but the legacy of their civilization endured. Today, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe stand as a monument not just to a lost kingdom, but to the resilience of African cultures that have continued to shape the continent's history despite the many forces that sought to erase them. As the centuries unfolded, the decline of Great Zimbabwe became a chapter of its own in the broader narrative of Southern Africa. The city, once a beacon of wealth and power, had been abandoned by the early 17th century. The ruins, silent and still, lay nestled amidst the harsh landscape, their once proud stone walls crumbling in the dust. Yet, even in its abandonment, Great Zimbabwe left a profound imprint on the people and the land. Its influence did not vanish with the fall of its kings. Instead, the legacy of the city continued to shape the region for centuries to come. After the abandonment of the city, the remnants of Great Zimbabwe's power were dispersed across the surrounding areas. The collapse of the central authority, which had once been embodied by the Mwini Matapa, did not signal the end of political complexity in the region. Rather, it marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of Southern Africa. As the power of Great Zimbabwe waned, several smaller kingdoms and states arose in its place. These successor states, though not as large or as influential as their predecessor, were profoundly shaped by the legacy of the city that had once been at the heart of their world. One of the most significant successor states was the Kingdom of Matapa, which emerged in the region to the north of Great Zimbabwe. While the Matapa Empire was not directly descended from Great Zimbabwe, it was deeply influenced by the same cultural and political traditions. The Matapa kings, like the rulers of Great Zimbabwe, controlled vast tracts of land and were heavily involved in the trade networks that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the interior of Africa. Gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities continued to flow through the region, even as the direct power of Great Zimbabwe faded. The Matapa rulers, in many ways, inherited the legacy of Great Zimbabwe's trade monopolies, as well as its methods of governance and social organization. However, the rise of new political entities in the wake of Great Zimbabwe's fall did not mark a return to stability. On the contrary, the region was now marked by political fragmentation and conflict. As smaller kingdoms jostled for power, rivalries and tensions arose, leading to frequent battles over territory, resources, and control of trade routes. The Matapa Empire itself would later be embroiled in a series of internal power struggles and external invasions, particularly from the Portuguese, who had steadily expanded their influence along the east coast of Africa. These conflicts were a direct consequence of the changes set in motion by the collapse of Great Zimbabwe. At the same time, the cultural legacy of Great Zimbabwe continued to echo through the centuries. The city's architecture, especially its dry stone construction techniques, was adopted and adapted by other cultures in the region. The Shona people, who were directly descended from the builders of Great Zimbabwe, continued to use similar architectural methods in the construction of their own dwellings and fortifications. The distinctive, mortarless stonework that had characterized the great enclosure and other structures in Great Zimbabwe became a hallmark of the region's architecture, appearing in various forms in the centuries that followed. The city's religious and cultural influence also endured. Although the Mwini Matapa's political power had faded, their religious authority and the belief in their divine connection to the land persisted. In many ways, The rulers of the successor states inherited the religious practices that had been central to Great Zimbabwe society. The role of the king as both political leader and spiritual figure remained a crucial part of the region's political structure. The connection between leadership and the divine, which had been embodied in the figure of the Mwene Matapa, continued to shape the social and political systems of the smaller kingdoms that followed. In the midst of all these political and cultural shifts, the Portuguese presence in the region continued to grow. The Portuguese had arrived in Africa in the late 15th century, seeking to establish trade routes and secure access to the wealth of the interior. By the early 17th century, they had established fortified trading posts along the coast and were pushing deeper into the interior. The Portuguese, eager to control the gold trade, sought to expand their influence by forging alliances with local rulers and undermining those who resisted their presence. The Portuguese quickly recognized the strategic importance of the region that had once been home to Great Zimbabwe. They established trade agreements with the Matapa Empire, but their ambitions were not limited to trade alone. The Portuguese sought to control the gold trade and gradually expanded their influence over the Matapa rulers. The Portuguese missionaries, who had accompanied the traders, also sought to convert the local population to Christianity, further complicating the political and cultural dynamics of the region. In the face of Portuguese expansion, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe's former power began to fade. The Portuguese pressure on the Matapa kings weakened their hold over the gold trade and the region's political landscape. The Matapa rulers, already struggling with internal divisions and external threats, found themselves increasingly at the mercy of foreign powers. By the late 17th century, the Portuguese had effectively established their control over much of the gold trade, and the political landscape of the region had shifted once again. The decline of Great Zimbabwe's influence and the rise of Portuguese power marked a turning point in the history of the region, signaling the beginning of a new chapter of European domination and exploitation. Despite the political fragmentation and foreign interference, however, the cultural legacy of Great Zimbabwe continued to exert a powerful influence. The ruins of the city, though abandoned and overgrown, remained a symbol of the region's past glory. The walls of the great enclosure, the stone pathways, and the intricate structures continued to captivate the imagination of those who encountered them. For the local populations, Great Zimbabwe remained a powerful reminder of a time when their ancestors had built one of the greatest cities in Africa. As the 18th century drew to a close, the memory of Great Zimbabwe lived on, though it had been obscured by centuries of colonialism, political upheaval, and cultural change. The city's ruins have been largely forgotten by European powers, who were focused on consolidating their control over the region. Yet, the people of the region never lost their connection to the past. Even in the face of foreign domination and internal strife, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe remained an enduring part of the collective memory of the Shona people and the broader Southern African world. It was not until the late 19th century, during the period of British colonial expansion, that the ruins of Great Zimbabwe would once again attract the attention of the outside world. As European explorers and archaeologists began to rediscover the city, they were struck by its scale and sophistication. The mystery of its origins, long lost in the annals of history, would once again come to the forefront of global attention. For a new generation of scholars, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe were no longer seen as a relic of a forgotten empire, but as a testament to the enduring strength and creativity of African civilizations. The rediscovery of Great Zimbabwe marked the beginning of a renewed interest in African history and culture, as scholars began to push back against the colonial narratives that had long sought to diminish the achievements of Africa's past. The city's legacy, long overshadowed by the forces of colonialism, was finally being recognized for what it was, a magnificent achievement of human civilization. Despite the centuries of decline, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe stood as a powerful reminder that Africa had once been home to complex societies that rivaled those of Europe and Asia. Today, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserved as a symbol of Africa's rich cultural heritage. They stand as a testament to the resilience of the people who built them, to the enduring power of their cultural traditions, and to the profound impact that their civilization had on the broader history of the world. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe, though fragmented and obscured by centuries of change, remains a vital part of Africa's historical narrative, a legacy that continues to inspire and inform our understanding of the continent's past. As the 17th century unfolded, Southern Africa found itself in the midst of profound transformation. The story of Great Zimbabwe, once a shining example of African architectural achievement and political power, had come to an end. Yet the legacy of the great stone city did not simply fade away. It became a focal point of historical intrigue, speculation, and eventually archaeological discovery. The decline of Great Zimbabwe did not mark the end of its influence, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Southern Africa, one that would be shaped by new forces, both internal and external. In the aftermath of the fall of Great Zimbabwe, the political landscape of the region fractured into smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms. These successor states, while varying in size and power, were all influenced by the historical and cultural foundation left behind by Great Zimbabwe. The political and economic models of Great Zimbabwe, based on trade, wealth, and centralized leadership, continued to resonate across the region, though in modified forms. The Mwene Matapa's reign, which had been the keystone of Great Zimbabwe's authority, fragmented into various dynasties, many of which were engaged in a constant struggle for resources and influence. One such kingdom was the Kingdom of Matapa, which arose to the north of the Great Zimbabwe ruins. This state, established by a group of rulers known as the Matapa, continued the legacy of gold mining and trade, albeit under new conditions. The Matapa kings managed to maintain control over some of the gold resources in the region, though their power was increasingly eroded by external pressures, particularly from the Portuguese. With the Portuguese now entrenched on the coast, their demand for gold and other precious commodities began to disrupt the Matapa kingdom's established trade networks. The Portuguese established their own routes, bypassing the middlemen and cutting into the region's wealth. The introduction of Portuguese colonialism had significant consequences for the political and economic stability of the area. While Portugal's influence initially took the form of commercial interests, it soon transformed into a more aggressive push for control. The Portuguese sought to impose their rule over the Matapa kings and the surrounding kingdoms, using a combination of diplomacy and military force. By the early 17th century, Portuguese traders and settlers were pushing farther inland, and their presence disrupted the traditional power structures that had once defined the region. The Matapa kings, weakened by internal division and Portuguese interference, struggled to maintain their authority, and over time, the once powerful kingdom became a shadow of its former self. Yet, despite this external pressure, the social and cultural legacies of Great Zimbabwe persisted in the region. One of the most enduring aspects of Great Zimbabwe's influence was its architectural legacy. The dry stone construction techniques used to build the great enclosure and other monumental structures continued to inspire local communities. While the grand city of Great Zimbabwe was no longer a thriving center of power, its architectural and cultural achievements lived on in the villages and towns that arose in its wake. The Shona people, direct descendants of the builders of Great Zimbabwe, continued to employ similar building methods in their own homes and forts, creating a lasting connection to their ancestors. This form of architecture, which involved the careful stacking of stones without mortar, became a symbol of the ingenuity and creativity of the people who had built Great Zimbabwe. The oral traditions of the Shona also preserve the memory of the once great city. Stories about the kings and queens of Great Zimbabwe, the wealth of the kingdom, and the intricate stonework that defined the city passed down through generations. These stories, passed from elder to child, became a means of preserving the history of Great Zimbabwe long after the physical city had been abandoned. For the Shona people, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe were not merely remnants of a forgotten past, but living symbols of their heritage. They understood the significance of the city and its place in their collective memory. And even as political power shifted and external forces grew stronger, the cultural significance of the city remained deeply embedded in the hearts and minds of the people. The Portuguese, while firmly establishing themselves along the coast, also played a significant role in the spread of Christianity in southern Africa. As missionaries arrived, they began the slow and often violent process of attempting to convert the indigenous populations to Christianity. The Portuguese brought with them a new worldview, one that sought to replace the traditional religious practices of the African peoples with the Christian faith. In some areas, the Portuguese found success in converting local leaders and their followers. In other regions, however, resistance to European influence remained strong, and the Shona, like many African groups, continued to practice their indigenous beliefs. Despite the foreign presence, the region's religious practices remained rooted in ancestral worship and the reverence for spirits. The Mwene Matapa, who had once been the central figure in the spiritual life of the kingdom, continued to be revered by those who retained the old ways. Even though the central authority of the Matapa kings had diminished, their connection to the divine persisted in local belief systems. The Mwene Matapa was still remembered as a sacred figure, and his descendants were often regarded as spiritual leaders by the people. The belief in the divine nature of kingship remained an important part of the cultural fabric of the region, even as political structures shifted and external forces attempted to impose new forms of governance. In addition to the Portuguese, the growing power of the Zulu kingdom to the south of the Matapa Empire also impacted the region. By the early 17th century, the Zulu, under the leadership of powerful kings like Shaka, were expanding their influence across southern Africa. The rise of the Zulu Empire led to further political fragmentation in the region, with various groups either aligning themselves with or fighting against the Zulu. While the Zulu did not directly conquer the areas that had once been part of Great Zimbabwe, their rise to power contributed to the reshaping of the political and social landscape in southern Africa. As the Portuguese continued to assert their dominance along the coast, the indigenous people of southern Africa faced increasing pressure from both foreign powers and internal conflicts. The once great city of Great Zimbabwe, which had stood as a symbol of African power and achievement, was now a relic of a past age. Yet, even as external forces sought to impose their control, the cultural memory of Great Zimbabwe remained strong. The ruins, though abandoned and weathered, continued to hold great significance for the people of the region. Throughout the 17th century, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe lived on not only through the stories and traditions of the local people, but also through the enduring spirit of resilience that characterized the region. Despite the decline of the city and the challenges posed by foreign colonization and internal fragmentation, the people of southern Africa continued to adapt and resist. The cultural, political, and economic structures that had been shaped by Great Zimbabwe, though altered over time, provided a foundation for the resilience of future generations. As the century progressed, European powers continued to push further into the interior of Africa, driven by the desire for resources and strategic control. The Portuguese, along with other European powers, established a foothold in the region that would last for centuries. But in the shadows of this colonial expansion, the memory of Great Zimbabwe persisted, reminding both the indigenous people of their ancient past and the Europeans of a civilization that had once rivaled the power of their own empires. In the final years of the 17th century, Great Zimbabwe had become little more than a distant memory, its once great civilization now lost to time. Yet, the city's ruins stood tall amidst the African landscape, a testament to a people who had created something remarkable. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe would continue to shape the future of southern Africa, influencing the course of history in ways that would not be fully understood until centuries later. The ruins, though abandoned, remained a powerful symbol of the ingenuity, resilience, and strength of the African peoples, a symbol that would be rediscovered and celebrated by future generations. The 18th century in southern Africa was a time of continued upheaval and change, as new forces reshaped the region's political, social, and economic structures. The once glorious city of Great Zimbabwe, which had been at the heart of an influential kingdom, stood abandoned, its towering stone walls now silent relics of a bygone era. The city's decline had not only marked the end of civilization, but had also set in motion a complex series of historical shifts that would reverberate through the centuries. While the ruins of Great Zimbabwe lay largely forgotten by the outside world, their significance remained alive in the hearts of the Shona people, who continued to carry the memory of their ancestors' achievements. It was during this period, as the region experienced the encroachment of European powers and the rise of new indigenous kingdoms, that the myth of Great Zimbabwe began to take shape in the collective imagination, both in Africa and abroad. By the time the 18th century began, the Portuguese influence in the region had been firmly established. Their initial commercial interest in the gold trade had led to a gradual expansion of their territorial control along the southeastern coast of Africa. Yet despite their growing presence, the Portuguese faced increasing resistance from local kingdoms and chiefdoms, many of which were still shaped by the legacies of Great Zimbabwe. The Matapa Empire, which had inherited some of Great Zimbabwe's political and economic models, remained a key player in the region, even as it struggled under Portuguese pressure. Although it had been weakened by internal divisions and external invasions, the Matapa Kingdom remained a potent symbol of the region's enduring connection to the grandeur of the past. Meanwhile, other forces were rising to challenge the dominance of the Portuguese and other European colonial powers. The Zulu Kingdom, under the leadership of Shaka Zulu, had begun its rapid expansion in the early 19th century. Shaka's military prowess and innovative tactics had transformed the Zulu into one of the most powerful kingdoms in southern Africa, and his influence would soon stretch across much of the southeastern part of the continent. The rise of the Zulu kingdom would not only alter the political landscape of southern Africa, but also have profound effects on the legacy of Great Zimbabwe. For the Portuguese, the growing power of the Zulu and the continued resistance from local populations posed serious challenges. Their attempts to control the gold trade and maintain dominance over the region's resources were being thwarted by the increasing strength of indigenous kingdoms. In addition, the arrival of new European powers, particularly the British, further complicated the Portuguese position. The British East India Company, along with various colonial enterprises, began to take a more active interest in the resources of southern Africa, including the rich gold deposits that had once flowed through Great Zimbabwe. The British presence in the region would soon challenge Portuguese dominance, and their expanding influence would have lasting consequences for the indigenous kingdoms that had once been so closely tied to Great Zimbabwe. The political fragmentation that characterized southern Africa during this period was also mirrored in the region's economic situation. While the gold trade had once been the lifeblood of Great Zimbabwe and its successor states, by the 18th century, the extraction and trade of gold had become increasingly difficult. The once rich gold mines that had sustained Great Zimbabwe were now exhausted, and the political instability caused by European encroachment further diminished the profitability of the region's gold trade. As the Portuguese and later the British sought to establish control over the gold deposits, they increasingly turned to other resources, such as ivory, slaves, and agricultural products, to sustain their colonial ventures. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe remained an important part of the region's cultural and historical fabric. For the people of Zimbabwe and surrounding areas, the ruins of the city stood as a potent symbol of their ancestors' achievements. The oral histories of the Shona people, passed down through generations, kept the memory of the city alive. The stories of the kings and queens who had ruled from the towering stone structures, the wealth that had flowed through the city, and the craftsmanship that had gone into the construction of the great enclosure were retold in song, dance, and ritual. These stories, though not always consistent with the historical record, helped to keep the spirit of Great Zimbabwe alive in the hearts of those who had inherited its legacy. Yet the myth of Great Zimbabwe began to take on new forms during this period. As European colonial powers expanded their presence in Africa, they began to turn their attention to the ruins of the city. For many Europeans, The idea of an African civilization capable of building such a magnificent city was inconceivable. Instead, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe became the subject of speculation and mystery. Early European explorers and scholars often attributed the city's construction to foreign civilizations, such as the Phoenicians, Arabs, or even the ancient Egyptians. This foreign origin theory persisted for much of the 19th century and was reinforced by colonial narratives that sought to undermine the achievements of African civilizations. The myth of a lost civilization, which had once been associated with Great Zimbabwe, gained traction in the Western imagination during the 18th and 19th centuries. For many Europeans, the idea that a great African civilization had existed and then mysteriously disappeared fit neatly into the colonial narrative of Africa as a land of darkness and savagery. The idea that Africans could not have built such sophisticated structures was part of the broader racial theories that sought to justify colonial rule and the exploitation of the continent's people and resources. As a result, the true history of Great Zimbabwe remained obscured by a combination of colonial prejudice and ignorance. However, in the early 20th century, the true origins of Great Zimbabwe began to emerge. Archaeological excavations, led by researchers such as Gertrude Cotton Thompson in the 1920s, began to uncover evidence that firmly linked the ruins to the Shona people and their ancestors. Cotton Thompson's work demonstrated that the stone structures were built by the people of the region, and that the city was part of a complex network of trade and culture that spanned much of southern Africa. This discovery challenged the prevailing colonial narrative and helped to establish the African origins of the city. Despite these revelations, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe continued to be a subject of debate and controversy. The ruins of the city remained a powerful symbol of Africa's past greatness, but their meaning was often distorted by both colonial and post-colonial narratives. For the African peoples of the region, Great Zimbabwe continued to represent a link to their ancestral heritage, a reminder of the cultural and political achievements that had once defined the region. Yet, for much of the world, the city remained an enigma, a lost civilization whose true significance had yet to be fully understood. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the political and cultural landscape of southern Africa continued to evolve. The rise of nationalist movements and the eventual struggle for independence from European colonial rule would once again bring the legacy of Great Zimbabwe to the forefront of the region's consciousness. For the people of Zimbabwe, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe would eventually become a powerful symbol of resistance, identity, and pride. The story of Great Zimbabwe, which had once been relegated to the realm of myth and mystery, would be reclaimed as a vital part of African history. In the broader context of Southern Africa's history, the decline of Great Zimbabwe and the myths that surrounded it served as a reminder of the complexities of colonialism and the ways in which history is often shaped by those who control the narrative. The memory of Great Zimbabwe, like the memory of many other African civilizations, was distorted and suppressed for centuries, yet it has survived. The enduring legacy of Great Zimbabwe, both as a physical monument and as a symbol of African history, continues to inspire new generations of Africans and scholars alike. Through the rediscovery and reclamation of its past, the story of Great Zimbabwe offers a profound lesson in resilience, pride, and the importance of understanding one's heritage. It stands as a testament to the achievements of an ancient civilization that, despite centuries of neglect and misinterpretation, continues to shape the cultural and historical landscape of Southern Africa. By the early 19th century, the landscape of Southern Africa had shifted significantly. The decline of Great Zimbabwe, the erosion of its former political and economic influence, and the rise of new kingdoms and powers marked a new era in the region's history. Yet, the legacy of the ancient city, though physically abandoned, remained a powerful symbol of Africa's past grandeur. As the world around it changed, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, perched atop the landscape in the heart of the Zimbabwean plateau, became both a historical enigma and a symbol of resilience. The once glorious kingdom had disappeared, but its memory persisted through the generations, and the echoes of its past achievements reverberated through both local and global historical consciousness. The 19th century was characterized by significant political and social transformations, particularly with the rise of European colonialism and the expansion of imperial ambitions across the African continent. While Great Zimbabwe had long since been abandoned by its original inhabitants, the ruins remained in the hands of local peoples who continued to revere them as sacred. To the indigenous Shona, the remnants of Great Zimbabwe's stone structures were more than just physical ruins. They were a link to their ancestral past, a testament to a time when their forebears had built one of the most remarkable cities in Africa. Despite the changing political landscape, the cultural memory of Great Zimbabwe remained embedded in the hearts of the people. The oral traditions passed down from generation to generation ensured that the history of the city and its rulers would not be forgotten. Though the city had ceased to be the central power in the region, its significance in the eyes of the Shona people could not be overstated. The kings and queens of Great Zimbabwe were still remembered as the founders of an empire whose influence had once stretched across much of southern Africa. And although the political institutions of the old city had crumbled, the idea of a centralized kingdom with monumental architecture and wealth continued to serve as a symbol of national pride. In the 19th century, however, the external forces of European colonialism began to have an even more pronounced effect on the region. European powers were expanding their spheres of influence, and the Portuguese, who had been entrenched along the southeastern coast since the late 15th century, were joined by other imperial powers, including the British and the Dutch. By the 1800s, the British Empire had begun to establish its dominance in southern Africa. The British, seeking to secure access to valuable resources such as gold and diamonds, turned their attention to the region that had once been home to Great Zimbabwe. The British influence, which would culminate in the colonization of modern-day Zimbabwe, was rooted in a belief that African civilizations were incapable of producing the kinds of monumental architecture and urban planning exemplified by Great Zimbabwe. Early British explorers and colonial administrators were often baffled by the ruins they found, unable or unwilling to acknowledge that the impressive stone structures had been built by indigenous African peoples. Instead, they subscribed to the foreign origin theory, which held that the ruins were the work of ancient Phoenicians, Arabs, or even biblical figures, but not the Africans who had lived in the region. The arrival of British colonialists in the late 19th century, led by figures such as Cecil Rhodes, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the region. Rhodes and his British South Africa Company were instrumental in establishing British control over much of southern Africa, including the territories that would eventually become Zimbabwe. The British were driven by the desire to exploit the region's rich resources, particularly gold, but they also sought to impose their own cultural and political systems on the local populations. They were interested in reshaping the social and economic structures of southern Africa to serve their imperial ambitions. The British encounter with the ruins of Great Zimbabwe was not merely one of cultural curiosity. It was also a confrontation with the very idea of African history and civilization. For many European colonists and settlers, the idea that Great Zimbabwe's magnificent stone ruins had been built by Africans was an uncomfortable challenge to their worldview. They were unable to reconcile the idea of African peoples building such an advanced city with their preconceived notions of Africans as primitive and incapable of great achievements. This discomfort led to the widespread belief that the ruins were the remnants of an ancient, foreign civilization that had disappeared long before the arrival of Europeans. This belief persisted for many years, despite evidence to the contrary. The work of early archaeologists, including the excavations carried out by the British archaeologist Gertrude Cotton-Thompson in the 1920s, gradually dispelled the myth of foreign origins and confirmed that Great Zimbabwe was indeed the work of the Shona people. Cotton-Thompson's excavations provided critical evidence linking the stone structures to the indigenous cultures of the region, demonstrating that the city's builders were African and that the city had been part of a complex and thriving trade network. While the revelations of Cotton Thompson and other archaeologists helped to challenge the colonial narratives about Africa's lack of history, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe remained largely ignored by the broader world for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The city's true historical significance was still largely obscured by colonial prejudice and ignorance. The ruins, once a powerful symbol of African greatness, were often dismissed or forgotten by the very powers that had once sought to control the region. Despite these challenges, the people of Zimbabwe and other parts of southern Africa continued to revere the ruins of Great Zimbabwe as a cultural and historical treasure. The oral traditions of the Shona people maintained a rich connection to the past, ensuring that the memory of the city's greatness endured. In the hearts of those who had inherited the legacy of Great Zimbabwe, the ruins were not merely a symbol of a lost civilization, but a source of inspiration and pride. They represented a time when Africa had been home to one of the continent's most advanced and sophisticated kingdoms. As the 19th century drew to a close, the political and cultural landscape of southern Africa was in flux. The advent of British colonialism in the region brought with it a new set of challenges for the indigenous peoples. The exploitation of resources, the erosion of traditional political systems, and the imposition of foreign cultural norms all had a profound effect on the region's social fabric. Yet, despite these pressures, the memory of Great Zimbabwe remained resilient. The ruins, though abandoned and forgotten by much of the world, stood as a testament to the enduring spirit of the people who had built them. For the Shona and other indigenous groups, the city represented a proud heritage that could not be erased by colonial rule or the passage of time. In the years that followed, as southern Africa grappled with the effects of colonialism and the struggle for independence, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe would once again become a focal point of national identity. The rediscovery of the city's true history in the 20th century would play a crucial role in reshaping the understanding of African civilization and its contributions to the world. Yet even as the political and social landscape of the region continued to change, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe remained steadfast, a powerful reminder of the continent's rich and diverse history. The 19th century, with its complex interplay of colonialism, resistance, and cultural preservation, set the stage for the eventual recognition and celebration of Great Zimbabwe's place in world history. The myth of the lost civilization would be replaced by a more accurate understanding of the achievements of the people who had built the city. As the 20th century dawned, Great Zimbabwe would rise once more, not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of Africa's resilience, creativity, and unbroken connection to its ancient roots. The ruins, once dismissed and forgotten, would reclaim their place in the annals of history, representing not just a moment in time, but the enduring strength of a civilization that had left an indelible mark on the world.